And now our guests for the program. Joining us, Mr. Don DeBar, activist and commentator, joining us out of New York from the States. And also joining us out of the States, Daniel Kovalik, author and human rights lawyer, joining us from Pennsylvania. Hello, gentlemen. Pleasure to have you both on, joining us in the program here. Hope you're both safe and doing well. I guess, let's see, we'll start with you, Don, out there in New York. Mr. DeBar, your initial thoughts on how back in early February of 1990, U.S. Secretary of State at the time, James Baker, he meets the Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, in Moscow. And to end the Cold War, he promises that the infamous not 1 inch vow, if you remember, that NATO will not expand 1 inch eastward after German reunification. Ultimately, the wall comes down. And this is one of the big guarantees. And guess why this war is being fought today?
And that was one of several, actually, assurances that the Elbe River would continue to be the demarcation line between the two blocks or the successor states to the two blocks. And ever since then, it's been more or less a mad dash up to Russia's border. First of all, that was as to the Soviet Union, not as to Russia. And instead, we now have the 3 Baltic states, Ukraine. They've tried to bring Georgia in. They've been manipulating the struggle between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And also they tried to flip Belarus and Kazakhstan. If you look at a map and consider all of those as having been conquered, quote unquote, with the attempted color revolutions or the actual overthrows of government there, and then match that against the map of how far Hitler's forces succeeded in entering the Soviet Union, you would see that the NATO actual shooting war, if that stuff had all been settled, would be even closer to the heart of Russia than Hitler was able to get after, losing, I don't know, 1.5 million troops or whatever. That pledge was broken within a few years of it being made. Certainly the Clinton and Bush and Obama years were a mad dash. Also, we have the coup d'etat in Ukraine that the United States engineered on the ground, on television, and on the telephone. You had the McCain and the Murphy and Blumenthal and others from the Congress here, and people from the State Department, Victoria Nuland and others, speaking to crowds outside the presidential palace and outside the parliament, encouraging them in essence to overthrow the government. Now, if you had someone from the Russian government, say President Putin, or someone from the Duma, Medvedev perhaps, or one of the folks from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, speaking in front of the crowd on January 6th outside the Capitol, they would have been hanging people outside of the Capitol before the afternoon was over. And yet that's what we did in Ukraine. And what we're looking at now on the ground is a product of all of that activity, beginning with the original pledge actually made in 1989, up to where we are today, where we're about to hear a pronouncement from President Putin, which we heard pretty much already, like the one JFK made, that any missile fired from Cuba against any party in the Western Hemisphere will be considered an attack, a direct attack by the Soviet Union upon the United States of America, and subject to a full retaliatory response. Now we're hearing exactly that. If these Tomahawk missiles that they're trying to hand over to the Ukrainians are fired against Russia, Russia's going to shoot back, and it ain't going to be at the Ukrainians.
Thank you, Don. Daniel, thanks for your patience and welcome to the program. Your first take as well, how, I don't know how to word this, how eloquently cunning Western politicians and media architects have been in painting Russia as the aggressor for attacking Ukraine and hence the West, and leaving out the entire history of manipulation, lies, broken promises, and provocative NATO expansion right up to Russia's doorstep over the past 30 to 40 years.
Yes, well, I think, Don, you gave a very good summary of that history. But I also, so, I mean, just to continue on, I mean, first of all, we have to start with the fact that the U.S., even before the collapse of the Soviet Union, the U.S. did a lot to try intentionally to destroy the Soviet Union in various ways, including by its support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Recall that Brzezinski, who was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, said they wanted to give Russia its Vietnam and Afghanistan, and that happened, and it did weaken the Soviet Union. And then when the Soviet Union collapsed, the U.S. basically looted Russia and, helped bring down its economy. And the result was the death of 2 million people. A history, again, not spoken of. And then in I think it was 93, there were elections in which Clinton really intervened to help Yeltsin win. And it's thought that he didn't win anyway, that in fact he stole the election. But in any case, the U.S. and the West have been interfering in Russia for a long time. As Don said, even if you look at World War II, I mean, the West really, helped build up Nazi Germany, held off opening a Western front for a long time, hoping that Nazi Germany would destroy the Soviet Union. All these things are remembered by Russia, right? But even despite all that, Putin and the Russians for a number of years were willing to believe and wanted to believe that the West would invite them back in, right? Going back to Peter the Great, Russia wanted to be part of Europe. And Putin thought that was possible. And then time and time again, he saw how Russia was betrayed. And, I think the coup in Ukraine in 2014, which Obama and Biden really helped pull off, which brought a ultra-rightist government into power, really was the last straw, right, in which Russia now knew that they were the target of Western aggression. And, in terms of Trump in particular, I think people forget what he did during his first term, which laid the groundwork for the major war in Ukraine, and that was his funding of Ukrainian forces, which would ultimately help lead to Russia's special military operations in 2022. So, long and short of it is Russia is not going to give up the gains it has made in Ukraine now. It knows it is an existential issue for them.
And we're going to talk about just that in about a second here. Don, back to you at this point, and I'm glad you alluded to these Tomahawks. Perhaps let's say if Kiev gets the Tomahawks it wants, billions more in funding from Europe, from the States, a crippling sanctions package against Moscow. Ultimately, what does this do for Kiev's chances of winning this conflict? You've been watching it going on for over 3.5 years now. What's it going to do, or nearly 4, or 3, sorry. But what's it going to do for Ukraine's chances of winning this conflict?
Well, Ukraine can't win the conflict. If Ukraine had a military advantage, Russia would be obligated to meet that. And if that meant destroying Ukraine in order to preserve Russia, obviously the choice would be for military planners and political planners in Russia to destroy Ukraine. They would have no choice if it came to that. All of the players involved understand this, by the way, including the Ukrainians. There are members of the Ukrainian leadership who are willing to go ahead with that, although it might mean the destruction of their own country. It tells you that there is a divergence between their own self-interest and that of the national interest. No one sane or no one honest who's in a position of authority would risk the destruction of the people that they're charged with protecting unless they had some countervailing personal benefit and disregarded their obligation to the constituents. The leadership in Kiev is clearly doing that, those that are pushing to expand the war. It's possible to negotiate a situation, an outcome for Ukraine that would be beneficial to the people of Ukraine, which in turn, by the way, would be beneficial to the leadership class that produced this. And that would be one where Ukraine treated itself as a bridge between Europe and Russia, calling in all of the wonderful words that all the European leaders have been bestowing upon Ukraine over the past few years, and saying, yes, in fact, we are all of those things, and now we would like to bring you and Russia to the table so we can all get rich and be happy together. That would be the outcome. That would, in essence, be the conclusion of the obligation of leadership in Ukraine would have to its people. Instead, accelerating this conflict can lead only to the destruction of Ukraine, and or if it's really going to be motivated in a direction that the people, some people in leadership here, too many of them, and also in Europe that are trying to motivate it towards, and that would be to try to gain military advantage over Russia, perhaps taking out its strategic defenses, which is it's gambling with the future of our species doing that. I can't imagine a single countervailing benefit that would accrue to any of us to risk that. And yet, that's what's being risked.
Thanks. Daniel, I'm glad you mentioned the U.S. president because I want to get your read on the guy, not the first term, but the second term, President Trump. At times, it's hard to read him. His few flip-flops and U-turns on this conflict. At times, it seems he understands the Russian perspective, and at times, seems like he's viewing it through tunnel vision. How do you see the Trump administration and perhaps Trump himself reacting to this conflict, how he sees it and why and how it impacts decisions he makes?
Well, I think you could only describe his conduct regarding Russia, which is similar to a lot of his conduct, as completely erratic. It seems like every day when he wakes up, he has a different view on what he wants to do, sometimes opposite from what he wanted to do the day before, right? So he, during his election campaign, he said he would settle the Ukraine crisis in 24 hours. It's one of the reasons he was elected. And then when he came to power, he said, yeah, we're going to settle this conflict. And then he quickly backtracked on that. And then he said, okay, well, I guess now I do want to settle it. And of course, he met with Putin in Alaska. And that seemed to be hopeful. That was the first time, I believe, a Russian leader ever met with a U.S. leader in Alaska since Alaska was sold to the United States. But then very quickly after that, he went back to his more belligerent stance towards Russia, and then he was going to, again, meet with Putin now, and now he's backtracked on that. So, I mean, it's impossible to discern any real principled, position that he has towards Russia. It makes one question, frankly, what his mental faculties are like at this moment. And a lot of people are questioning that, by the way.
And Don, would you like to weigh in on that? U.S. President, at times, you hear him criticize NATO members' contribution, NATO as a body, its missions, it dragging the U.S. Into conflict when it's usually the other way around. He signaled that Ukraine may have to give up some serious territory that Daniel alluded to just moments ago, and the West give Russia some guarantees for peace to ultimately prevail. And then in the same breath, we hear him engage in decisions and rhetoric and actions that will only prolong this conflict, Ukrainian suffering, and continue to destabilize this region. What's your read on the guy moving forward?
For real here. First of all, almost all of our contact with this stuff is virtual anyway. It's mediated. We don't sit down in the conference room with any of the players. You don't hear what goes on when they negotiate in the background. We don't read the memos. We don't have any firsthand knowledge of it. So what we're dealing with is the public face of it, which again, I'll say is mediated, heavily mediated. With that said, I can see at least two possible scenarios, one of these two possible scenarios, and perhaps many others, I don't know. One scenario is that things are exactly as they appear, and that in fact Trump is just a distraction version of the previous administrations, and that the same policy is being pursued, but with some sort of adjustment based on PR work and market data. That this is how they sell what they're going to do instead of the way they were selling it before. Another is that there's actually a contradiction inside the leadership circles over what exactly to do in the international sphere generally and in particular with respect to the U.S., Russia, China, and the rising alternative, quote unquote, BRICS, et cetera. But if it's the latter, the scenario that may be playing out, again, there are other possible ones, but the one that I'm going to put out is that he's trying to satisfy. First of all, his own position is a sort of ad hoc assemblage of a variety of disparate constituencies that's very shaky and is under constant attack in the media and inside the circles of power and politics. And so it's a very fragile coalition that is they attempt to shatter every day on a daily basis. You can see the manifestations of that, if that's what it is, in the news every day. And so if he's attempting honestly to try to back out of the war with Russia, there are a number of constituencies among the power group that he has to satisfy. One way of satisfying the arms manufacturers who are making money now is to make sure that they're going to make money by pulling out also. And so if he can argue to us, we're tired of carrying the military bill for Europe while they get the people there get health care and all these other things that we don't get. We're going to make them pay their own share. Some of us were hoping that meant that they'd stop spending in Europe and stop spending here, but instead he's ginned it up. So now that he wants them to spend 5% of their GDP, and the benefit for the people here being they're buying American arms and such. So there's military Keynesian effect, and also of course big profits dropping into the pockets of people in power. It may be some kind of a game going on like that, and it may be, in fact, the entire thing is a clown show. This is all, in essence, Pied Piperism, and that we are looking at a very dangerous and perhaps terminal international situation.
And I'm glad you used that exact phrase, clown show, because that was actually going to bring me to my next point. Not to call it a clown show, but to ask Daniel what he calls it. What do you call it, Daniel? When the collective West, they speak of this conflict as the most pressing issue in the democratic world today. The Western way of life is at risk. European sovereignty is at risk, in fact, under existential threat. Yet you're giving the Ukrainians the level of sophisticated weaponry where they bleed slowly, they stay in the fight, but you don't give them the advanced weapons they've been asking for all along to have a true fighting chance. What do you call this?
I would say insane. I mean, obviously the West is courting nuclear war. And the greatest threat to the West is not Russia, it's the Western leaders themselves, who frankly don't represent their people, who most of which, even in the U.S., do not see Russia as an enemy. Speaking as an American, in the United States, our biggest concern is the economy. And Russia's not seen as an enemy. And to the extent that the leaders of the West continue to hammer home on this, it's completely self-destructive. It has destroyed the European economy because it has cut Europe off from cheap Russian gas. I say cheap because they're still getting Russian gas, but through, mediated means that cost them a lot more money. If the Western leaders cared about Western civilization, they would look inward. And they would frankly stop the war in Gaza, which has completely destroyed all credibility they have and all claims to being a civilization at all. So again, they're the big threats, the Western leaders, not Russia.
We have less than a minute left. I want to give that same question to you, Don. Do you see any scenario where Russia gives back the territories in Ukraine that it has gained, that it accepts Ukraine as a NATO member, that it even concedes any of the things that Vladimir Zelensky has been asking for to put an end to this conflict? And if not, then why is the West still funding and supporting this conflict?
Russia must see Ukraine be demilitarized. That's an existential question for Russia, since the purpose of militarizing Ukraine from the outside would be to target Russia with troops on its border in that location. If Ukraine is not demilitarized by negotiation. It will be demilitarized, in fact, and must be, again, even if that means demilitarizing it by turning it into a steaming wasteland. This is a very ugly possible outcome. But you're talking about, on the other hand, an empire that has expanded itself to the four corners of the earth and now surrounds Russia, China, and parts of Eurasia in between, that is now hungry for those parts and aggressively moving to take them. Either they're going to stand and fight, or they're going to acquiesce, and you will have a global, truly global empire that looks and smells exactly like the one that exists in Europe, North and South America, and parts of Asia. So I don't see an easy way out unless some reality sets in on all parties, and there's a negotiated peace that removes the military threat to Russia from its borders and leaves room for Kiev and Moscow to establish a rapprochement and normal relations.
Gentlemen, always a pleasure. Enjoyed having you both on. Thank you to both of you. Don DeBar joining us out of New York, and Daniel Kovalik there joining us from Pennsylvania, both out of the States. And viewers, this brings us to the end of your Press TV Spotlight program. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye for now.